Hello and welcome to Geekarati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life below the earth.
Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters?
I am Sinister.
Hi, I'm Christian Linkey, and I'm joined today by Luke Y. Thompson, film critic extraordinaire, who has a long history reviewing horror films and genre films throughout the industry and has even worked on a couple. And we're here to talk about kids today and horror films. You can see that Luke is dressed up for the occasion, and I am in proper dark academia attire with a Geekarati twist. So I've got my Beholder coffee mug. Can't take things too seriously as we delve into these topics, but we're going to talk about today's horror films and what the young people today think about them and how it's kind of mildly ironic given the history of negative reactions to the horror genre. Luke, you commented to me in an email or a text exchange recently about something you noticed, and I'd like you to just share that with me, and then we'll riff off of that.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, brought my little kid to action figure of a kid today as Art the Clown from Terrifier. Obviously, I'm a defender of the Terrifier films, and I'm used to seeing comments online that say, these movies are pointless. They have no artistic merit except to show gratuitous torture, blah blah blah. And I'm used to that. I don't agree with them, but I saw an article the other day, and I don't want to be. To be clear, I don't want to be like one of those guys who sees one article and smears an entire group by it, like the person the person who saw one complaint about Snow White being kissed by a prince on the ride at Disneyland, and all of a sudden, the entire woke left hates Snow White being kissed by Prince Charming. I don't want to go. So I don't want to go there, but it just made me think of the generation gap between my parents and myself in the other direction, which was this was a younger writer who was talking about how today's horror movies are just gratuitous gore and torture, and they don't have any artistic merit. And they weren't like, say, the Saw films, which actually had a point to them and actually had some thought behind them. It's like, girl, you have not been alive long enough, because I remember when the Saw films came out, and I remember being out on that island defending the Saw films and being told, oh no, they're just pretending to have a point. That's just pomposity that's a cover for all the gore and the torture. And it's notable that the only Saw movie with a fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is Saw 10. It is not because the movies got exponentially better, it's because the kids that grew up on the first ones finally became critics. And so, as someone who spent the early days trying to fight the good fight against the derogatory terminology of torture porn, and who was even approached by Tobin Bell at a junket because he had read my piece defending the Saw movies and other similar ones, Hostel 2 being another one, Captivity. There were a whole phase of them at the time because they were representing the zeitgeist, and certain amounts of, I deny that the Saw movies have torture in them. A fast-acting death trap is not torture, but torture was in the zeitgeist at the time. And I think I've lost I think I've, like someone speaking in German, I've lost the strain of the sentence that I was going to put the verb at the end of. But I think it's ironic to have kids who grew up on the Saw movies now being adults saying that the Terrifier movies are just terrible, horrible, and have no artistic merit. Because when I was a kid, Night of the Living Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre were these horror movies that had no artistic merit, not like the old Universal horror movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, and they were just horrible gore fests. And now some of the boomer critics are like, well, Night of the Living Dead is actually about racism. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually about Vietnam. What's Saw about? What's Terrifier about? Well, I can tell you if you want to sit down and talk to me about them.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean, I was talking with some of my students the other day, before class because it's Halloween season and we were chatting about horror movies. I was asking them what films that they enjoyed and things like that. And one of my students said, "Well, what do you mean by horror movies, or what are horror movies about, right? Like, what is it that makes them work? And I said, horror movies are always about the anxiety of the moment, of the time that they're made, which is why you see, right? You mentioned Night of the Living Dead, right? You have the first one, very clearly, George Romero is talking about racism, but there's also the sense of conformity, right, that was being pushed back against, that you saw in films like uh, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the older one, and things like that. That the conformity came from two positions, right? You had the people on the right who were afraid of communist conformity. You had the people on the left who were afraid of that kind of 1950s suburban conformity, right? And there's pushback on that, and there's real anxiety in society. And then by the time you get to Day of the Dead, it's about consumerism and the fear of losing your identity to something as meaningless as that. And I've always been one of these people who thinks that all horror goes talks that has any kind of connection with an audience is about the anxieties of the time. And I might ask you, because I haven't watched the full. It's a trilogy now, right? The Terrifier films.
Terrifier, if you don't count All Hallows Eve, which is a compilation, a sort of attempt to compile the two Art the Clown short films into a longer feature, then yes, Terrifier is a trilogy.
Yeah, because I've only seen the first one, and I've read your reviews on the other one. So I know that you've written, because my primary exposure to Terrifier 2 and 3 is through your writing, that actually it has a lore and it does connect with some of the stuff that's going on in our time.
It does have a lot. I just want to go back to Invasion of the Body Snatchers because I recently got the 4K with multiple commentaries, and I know everyone tends to sort of go to communism on it, but the writer's original intent, believe it or not, was to criticize TV commercials and the conformity that was being pitched by TV commercials.
I don't
So
find that hard
that's
to believe at all.
I don't
That's
you don't want you don't once you hear it. It's just not a lot of people talk about it anymore. So I thought that was just something we should bring up.
no, I think that's great. Like, I wouldn't have thought of that. And then you say it, and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, particularly that era of television commercials, right? You're talking about the Mad Men era and the perfection of that. And that reminds me of when kids are taught Fahrenheit 451, right? It's always like, oh, it's about censorship and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And I remember being at a Comic-Con, and a teacher, English teacher, high school teacher, stands up, and Ray Bradbury's on the panel, Ray Harryhausen's on the panel. It was a fantastic panel if you love like kind of classic 60s, early 70s genre pictures, and says this, oh, it's about censorship and et cetera, et cetera. And Ray Bradbury's like, no, it's about television and how it rots your brain. It's always been about television and the way that it destroys the individual and culture. And the more that I viewed it through that lens, the more I see, like, when the wife gets her opportunity to participate in the Feely, that's something that you see now today a lot with reality TV, or maybe even that's motivating a lot of social media, maybe even what's motivating what I'm doing right now in conversation with you, right? Is this desire to connect with a greater audience and society, as we are ourselves in some ways more isolated in the digital age than we were before, when you were compelled to hang out with your neighbors whether you wanted to or not.
Oh, when I was a kid, our teachers were going off on MTV, and MTV was the reason why nobody was reading. But I've been, turning on MTV Classic at night, and music videos were sort of amazingly surreal works of art for the most part. That were an example of people with limited resources choosing to be weird because they couldn't necessarily be realistic. And there are, I think, multiple theses and critical books to be written on this. I don't know if I'm the guy to do it because I don't feel like I have the time, but boy, some of those I look back and I'm like, these are works of art. These are not necessarily rotting my brain. So I don't think that you necessarily can't have that kind of art in TikTok and other things, but
Right. No, I
uh,
don't. I don't mean the medium is the problem. I'm just saying that, you see the kind of uh, I would say cult of celebrity and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
and the kind of social alienation that we have, which I don't think is caused by social media, but I certainly think social media provides us with a tool that allows us to wallow in it instead of engaging more personally. My own experience with social media is, I end up with, let's say on Substack or whatever, I'm chatting with people in Australia, I'm chatting with people in England, all kinds of places around Germany, places around the world are chatting with me and in real time, and I'm building friends in places that you couldn't do that if you were just in the old world, except through what, pen pals, and then you would have the delay of months or weeks to get
Or
your response.
ham radio in some cases, I suppose.
Yeah,
Uh,
right. Right. Ham radio filled that gap too, right? That I'm very, for the most part, optimistic about social media, but I do think that it enables certain pathologies. And just to go back to horror films, there obviously have been a couple of horror movies about social media, and the social contagion concept of like the fear of things like Tide Pods or whatever the current trend is to follow has informed a lot of horror movies, right? Because films like Smile, well, they're about other things as well, celebrity, etc. They're also
yeah,
about social contagion, right? And the fact
yeah,
that something can go viral and lead to negative consequences.
yeah. I promise I will get back to Terrifier in a moment, but I think the problem is less with the kids using this technology, and it's with the adults who. There's no sort of monoculture anymore. There's no Walter Cronkite. It's the adults that sort of streamline themselves into echo chambers with their media, and so the Super Bowl. I love to still watch the Super Bowl and like the Dick Clark New Year's Eve because I feel like those are still the two times that we sort of have that.
Sure.
But like I would love to listen to new music, but there's no radio station that plays it, that plays like everything that's new the way radio stations used to. There's nothing like that anymore, and people aren't getting their news from any reliable sources. They're mostly getting it from echo chambers, and a lot of the media I feel is really failing at covering this moment because they're more concerned about profits than about what they're, and not even profits, because the frustrating thing is newspapers can be profitable, they just can't increase dividends for shareholders every quarter, and that's why they're dying. That's a whole other topic, but maybe I should get back to Terrifier at this point. But I think, I think this goes back to the kids today. I think it's the adults maybe that are the problem, and I want the kids today. And I've tried to be this as a former kid of today to not become the adult of yesterday. And I see you do it as well because you work with kids. To not set a barrier and say, culture stopped here with me, and
No,
none of this
I
stuff is relatable.
Yeah, I do not think that the adults of today, and I'm including millennials in this, they're not ready for the brain rot that current eighth graders are generating with AI. And the thing that amazes me about it is, when I see a lot of older people using AI, they're using it to manipulate stuff in a realistic way, maybe to that would be potentially dangerous, and you might think that something fake is real or something like that. But when you look at the way young people are using it, they're using it like paint. And they're literally just creating right now absolute nonsense. Like I'd mentioned in an earlier Geekerati, the Italian brain rot, which, that was a big fad
Yes.
for a while. But it's amazing what they're doing. And that's the kind of direction. And, and this isn't AI created, but it's animated. The whole Skibbity Toilet, which has run its course and gone through its cycle of 15 minutes of fame or whatever. But that's amazing to me, and it's creative. It's kind of nonsense, but youthful creation is, and then that ends up create when they're in their 20s, they end up in 30s, 40s, they end up creating some pretty amazing stuff based on the tools that they used as a child. So I don't think
Yeah.
we're ready for what they're going to make. Uh,
Yeah.
and but
And I
going
think
back, going back to the
take
Terrifier.
Terrifier. Yes, take us back. Remi- Remind me, it was about the lore of the Terrifier, right?
Yeah,
That
right. I
was
mean, the contrary to, I'm not saying Saw doesn't have lore. Saw has lore, and you've written about Saw's lore,
uh,
and I think a lot of
they got
people are deeply familiar with it. The first movie, not so much. It's more personal, but it definitely developed its own mythology as it progressed.
yeah.
But the Terrifier, like, you've written about the series, and apparently there's like a lot of religious symbolism that maybe people are missing out on.
Yeah, I mean it's again the first one doesn't have a lot of lore, although the first one does some interesting things. It's told a little bit non-linearly, and the final girl is basically becomes a monster, but you don't know that because you meet her as a monster first, and it turns out she was the final girl. And the second one is, I mean, the first one's a little harsh for a lot of people. The second one is, I think, where it really all comes together because you can either listen to Damien Leone's commentary on the Blu-ray, or if you get lost in part two, part three explains it all. But Art the Clown is basically the worst human being in the world, and after he kills himself rather than get captured in the first movie, I think it's okay to spoil the first Terrifier because it's been out a while, and obviously he doesn't die forever. He's resurrected by a demonic force that takes the form of a little girl that's sort of cosplaying as a version of him, but is more disturbing than that. It's not just she's a little cosplayer. Like her eyes are upside down, her upper and lower jaw are reversed. She's really creepy looking, and she kind of, as controlled by this demonic force, has a mission for him, which he doesn't really care about because he's just having fun killing and torturing people. And where art I think really taps into the zeitgeist is with you hear people in media and politics say the cruelty is the point, right? That's motivating a lot of people right now. That's true with art as well. Art really is the cruelty is the point. He doesn't want to just lop off someone's head with a machete. He's entertained by the cruelty of killing someone slowly. But he's being manipulated by this evil force because he's kind of the avatar of hell. And this other girl, Sienna, is the avatar of heaven or good, and she's first tested in a dream sequence to see if she's up to it. So the first time she meets Art, it's a dream version of him. It's not really him. It's like the Darth Vader on Dagobah kind of thing, but it's also like a Freddy Krueger inspired nightmare. And it turns out her dad was a comic book artist, and he foresaw the coming of Art as a demonic force, so he made her an enchanted sword that is the one weapon that can kill him, but it has to be baptized by fire first, which it does after she passes the test in the dream. And her dad's ability to foresee all of this gave him a brain tumor that killed him and has left her without a dad. And so it builds to a confrontation between her and Art as the force of good and the force of evil in this place called the Terrifier, which is a house of horrors that's built above a portal to hell. And so, as you can tell from that, that's a lot of mythology going on there.
Yeah,
The
and it
little
seems.
pale girl is replaced in part three by the original final girl, Victoria, who was the monstrous one. She's been in an asylum the entirety of two, and then she becomes possessed by the demonic force. And by the end, they're doing this Christmas. They've sort of crashed Sienna's Christmas party, and they're giving her stigmata in her hands and a crown of thorns, and she's having visions of a statue of the Virgin Mary that's giving her a sign that she's heaven's champion. It's very well. I said it was borderline a Christian movie, and I think it is in the sense of maybe not even a Mel Gibson Christian movie, maybe a Hutton Gibson Christian movie, because it's the sadomasochism to the max from crucifixion and stigmata and pain, going through pain as a way to transcend. So there's a lot of that in there in addition to, Art the Clown is kind of like Harpo Marx as a serial killer. David Howard Thornton, I think, is really pulling a lot of that from Harpo. I just saw Marx Brothers movies recently and I was like, huh, David Howard Thornton really is doing some of this stuff when he's Art, and he's also doing a little bit of Will Ferrell and Elf. Um, so there's a lot more I think going on to these, and I think sometimes you can have all this go. Some people might say, "Well, Damien Leone doesn't seem that smart to be putting all that in a movie," and but he doesn't necessarily have to. If he's working subconsciously, you can analyze the movie and connect it to the zeitgeist without him necessarily having intended it. The ultimate example of that is Rob Zombie, who in every interview I've seen with him about his movies makes clear that he doesn't intellectualize them at all. He's thinking about them as paintings, and any subtext is there because it's just come out of him. I don't know if he knows the extent to which The Devil's Rejects is patterned on The Empire Strikes Back, but it's very clear to me, for example. So,
Yeah, and I think like with all the stuff that you've written about the Terrifier, and I just see like going to that comment, you say that maybe he's not, let's say literate enough. I'm not going to use the term smart enough, but let's say like versed in like classic literature enough. I see a lot of those same themes in things like Spawn, right? The comic book.
yeah.
So like even if you just had only had exposure through the kind of I'm not going to say watered down because I actually like Spawn, but filtered through the medium of comic books a lot of ideas that deal with religious symbolism and things like that, right? During that era when Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and stuff were writing just to add some lore to the Spawn book, which then, was launched off from and then used to great effect later on throughout the series. Even Art the Clown has certain similarities to villainous characters in Spawn. So even if like I'm not saying he's ripping off Spawn, I'm just saying like even if that was the only thing he'd ever read, he would still be being engaged with a lot of these kind of deeper cultural issues or cultural constructs that have been throughout Western literature forever. And in fact, as you point out, right, they're ubiquitous. So you don't have to, you know, you don't have to be necessarily deeply read to incorporate them. You might, if you're more deeply read, incorporate them more intentionally, but sometimes that's not good. Sometimes you get too intentional in your insertion of these ideas, and then it go. It's why right Tolkien always pushes back about Lord of the Rings being a Christian parable, even as he says it's the most Catholic thing he's ever written. But that's because while there is symbolism, you know that's just because there is. But that's not what it's about. It's about these other things and other ideas.
Don't tell the people at Movie Guide.
Fair enough. Uh,
um, yeah, I mean, and I don't want to say Damien Leone isn't smart. I'm saying that
right.
that's the sort of thing people will sometimes say to me is, well, but that director, I don't think they're smart enough to be putting that in there because I've listened to Leone's commentaries. He's a big David Lynch fan, and will say he will say simultaneously, I'm influenced by David Lynch on this, but I'm definitely not saying I'm on the level of David Lynch.
Yeah, but I mean,
Which he's
once
not.
again, yeah, I mean, David Lynch deals with a lot of those ideas. So if you watch
Yeah,
a lot of David Lynch, you're going to draw from that, even as a fan, right?
yeah.
So yeah, I mean that makes sense, uh, perfect sense to me. So the thing, and I want to come back to this because like I'm going to name this episode "Kids Today." Why do you think, like, historically, it's been the older generation who has pushed back, right? So the generation of critics, which would, I guess, be the first generation of real film critics, when they were reacting against Hammer Studios and saying, oh my gosh, Hammer Studios is hyper-sexualized these horror stories and they've made them super gory and there's added nudity and sexual perversion and it just is ruining the classic universal monsters, right? Those are older people making these
Yeah,
claims, right? These are
yeah,
people in their 40s or 50s, when David Edelstein wrote the term torture porn in his article in New York Magazine in 2006, the one that we did the podcast about long, long ago in the before times and the not now. Uh,
yeah.
he was an older critic, not ancient, but an older critic and a well-established one, and not somebody who was merely beginning their career trying to establish brand, right? Because it's important. I mean, it is important to establish brand, and my guess is that this critic who's pushing back against the Terrifier while praising Saw is trying to establish some kind of brand, or at least go viral a little bit earlier in
And
the career.
maybe I don't necessarily want to accuse someone of that. When I write about a thing, I try to I'm not generally trying to go viral or necessarily thinking about my brand. It's just what I'm thinking. I think if I thought about my brand, I'd be doing a lot better. So I don't want to. I don't want to necessarily put that as someone's motive if it's not explicit in there, but they could be.
Yeah, and I don't mean that pejoratively, right? I think of it in terms of like the
Pardon
way
me.
that. Sure.
Toby, stop.
All right.
Sorry,
That's all right.
that
I
was the
think of it,
noise in the background.
I think of it in terms of, every critic, if they want people to take them seriously, has to have something unique to say. And maybe I'm being a little cynical by saying that that's defining brand, but you know, there's a bit of pretense or hubris in thinking that people value your opinion, right? I share my Substack because I'm kind of compelled to write about the things that I like in pop culture. I would write it if I had no audience, but the fact of the matter is
Same.
that I do assume that my opinions are worth reading. And I'm sure this young person does too, and I mean that in a good way. So even as we're disagreeing with this person, I'm kind of praising them for having the courage to write in today's market, since we all know that immediately when you put your opinions out there, you're going to be attacked. But the thing that as I say, just going back to the thing that I found ironic is that in this case, it's a younger person who's taking this position, uh, favoring classic horror films like Saw over these
Yeah.
new meaningless horror films like The Terrifier.
Well, younger than me anyway. I mean, they may not be 20 somethings. They may be 30 somethings or so,
Well, I mean,
old
if they're
enough.
millennial, then that puts it in a context too, because millennials, they grew up with Tumblr being their source of criticism and stuff, and so they would be more, I think, sensitive to that, and yet still be edgy enough to defend Saw, but not quite edgy enough to buy into what's new.
I think with the Hammer versus Universal, you're talking about a difference with fundamentally a difference with the production code. Universal couldn't, if they had wanted to, made movies that gory or sexy. But some of the source material is that gory and sexy, and they could have, and so now the code falls. They have the opportunity to do that. And when you're a teen, I think or teen in your early 20s, you feel things a lot more intensely, and sometimes you think you're a lot edgier, and once you become a parent, you get. I assume I'm going to defer to you on this because you're the parent and I'm not, but I feel like when people become parents, they become a lot more protective, and they start worrying about, well, I'm okay watching this, but what's going to happen to my kid watching this? And that makes the radar a bit more sensitive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that exists to a certain extent, but I don't know. I was still the guy who, when my daughters, I think they were 3, maybe 4. I can't remember the exact age. But my friend James was over at the house, and I decided I'd already seen Troll Hunter. Is it Swedish or Finnish, Norwegian, whichever one from the European North, about the kind of kooky guy discovered footage film about engaging with and hunting trolls, right?
Well,
And there's a
the good
scene,
one. Yeah, that's a good
yeah,
one.
no, it's very good. Uh, but there's a scene where he's like, dumping buckets of blood on the bridge and like putting goats out to attract a troll to hunt it. And I'm watching this, and my daughters are 3 or 4. They're sitting playing Legos on the carpet in front of the television, and my wife walks in and she said, "What is that on the television?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's no big deal. that's just lamb's blood. And she's like, no. And I think that's true. I mean, I certainly like that's just an extreme example for me. There are other examples where I have pulled back and said no. You know, obviously they're too young. But in this case, I don't know. I don't think it's so much a generational thing, and I don't think it's a gender thing either. So much as like when I was like 6 years old, The Exorcist had come to our town as a rerun in the drive-in, and something else was on at the drive-in that was child appropriate. So my parents, they we went to watch the child film, but then I ended up watching The Exorcist afterward at the later screening. When I was like 6, maybe 7 years old. So that's a matter of and I'm not saying that that's like the best idea, though that didn't scare me much. It was actually the only thing I remember being actively scared about from a horror movie or a horror thing as a kid was there was a 1980s horror movie called The Legacy about people potentially inheriting a fortune, but then they die one after one after one from this old dude who I'm not going to spoil, even though it's super old. I'm not going to spoil what the MacGuffin is. I'm just going to say the guy was dying and they were going to inherit, and his hand comes out from the curtain of the like oxygen curtain that he's in around his bed in the hospital area of the house. And I couldn't use a shower with a shower curtain for like a decade after that
Oh,
because I was so frightened by the
uh,
creepy old hand coming through the shower curtain.
Watcher in the Woods did that for me in Mirrors.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
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 That's a Disney movie, But those scary movies you saw as a kid, you remember them so intensely. Like was the Omen for me. I saw on TV. God, I must have been like 10 maybe, and you just remember it so vividly and as sort of a level above, and then you see other horror movies and they look cheaper, and maybe it's that they can't measure up to those first horror movies you saw as a kid when you weren't supposed to. There might be some factor of that in there.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think it's a little unfair to compare something to like The Exorcist or The Omen because those are, actually extraordinarily well made films. And, there are a lot of horror movies that are made today, some of which are extraordinarily well made, but a lot are, they're lower budget and they're frayed around the edges because they're where people are building their careers, right?
Well,
You're,
then I'll say, around the same time as The Omen, there was Don't Be Afraid of the Dark and Don't Go to Sleep, which are TV horror movies that are not as well regarded, but to me at that age they were the same level as The Omen.
oh, sure, sure, I guess. I mean, I still have a soft spot for a lot of the movies that I watched as a kid, and in fact, I noticed. I think it's HBO on their TCM because HBO. It's HBO Max again, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's on HBO Max. It might be on their TCM sub category, but it doesn't matter. That they brought The Prophecy, which is one of the movies that I recommended 2 weeks ago or whatever,
Like
as
the
one of the
Christopher
films.
Walken prophecy?
Huh?
The
No,
Christopher
no.
Walken.
This one is it's about a mutant bear from mercury poisoning in the water. Uh that's supposed to take place in the Pacific Northeast or in the Atlantic Northeast, but is clearly filmed in like once you live in the Mountain West, anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, you're like, no. Like you can't fool me. Like if it's British, like you can pass off British Columbia as Seattle or whatever, but you can't pass off British Columbia as Maine, and you certainly can't pass it off as they tried to do in a recent romantic comedy I watched on Netflix called The Wrong Paris, which overall, by the way, was an entertaining film. This is not a critique of the film, except to say that the site location, Paris, Texas, looks nothing like the Mountain West. The rolling hills of Texas don't look like the Rocky Mountains or the Cascades. So, like when you're like, what are all these birch trees doing here in Texas? Uh,
And is it relevant to the plot in any way to have it be there?
yeah, the whole Well, okay, so I know we're talking about horror movies, but like the whole point of The Wrong Paris, and it's actually like the conceit of this film. Like I really, actually, really enjoyed this film. It's got the young girl who played the drummer in School of Rock, who, or not drummer, the bassist in School of Rock, who then went on to, I think it's iCarly on Nickelodeon. And then she's the romantic lead in this. And then the male lead is another, not Nickelodeon, but like Disney Channel. One of them, child stars also growing up. But the premise is that the young woman wants to go to art school in Paris, but can't afford it. But there's this reality TV show based on The Bachelor that you get a choice between love or money at the end. So she decides, her sister convinces her to sign up. She decides to audition since it takes place in Paris. And she's like, even if I lose, like, don't even make it past the first week. I got the airfare to France. I get the I get the scale for showing up and the $50,000 fee that they pay you to shut up. And that's enough for me to pay for art school in Paris, and I've already got the free trip, so I'll just do this. And then it turns out that it takes place on a ranch in Paris, Texas. So yeah, it's supposed to be Paris, Texas, and it matters that it's Paris, Texas. So like when I see them riding their horses in a place that, it could be Montana, okay, that would fly, but it's, the Mountain West. In this case, I think that it's actually British Columbia, but as I say, anywhere in the Mountain West, you can pretty much find a place that looks like somewhere else in the Mountain West, so you can pass it off. But once you've lived here in the mountains, it's like no, it's just like living in LA, right? That you just start recognizing locations in movies,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh yeah, I know where that is. I mean, let alone the sets, right? That when you go to the studios and you do there's the Warner tour, there's the MGM tour, right? There's obviously the Universal tour, and I mean everybody should recognize Universal. That just is like Universal Town, but you start to recognize like the Paramount lot's one I recognize all the time. Like I'm like, that's New York City in in uh, in the Paramount lot, because I spent a lot of time on the Paramount lot when Jody worked there. So uh, and I mean they're great locations, but you come to recognize them. So um, it doesn't take me out of things to recognize locations, but uh, it becomes like a little bit of a game, uh, and certainly it didn't take me out of The Wrong Paris, which, as I said, I didn't want to make it sound like I didn't enjoy the film, because for a Netflix romantic comedy, uh, which takes place in the Netflix romantic comedy universe, it was up there. Like I enjoyed it. It was a good time.
They have a shared universe now, or is this
Oh no,
like
it's
for
totally
real?
a shared. This is the funny thing. If you watch enough of them, you will see them watching other, like they'll reference other Netflix movies in them, sometimes as movies they're watching, but sometimes as news stories, which means that in some sense, Netflix romantic comedies, particularly the Christmas ones, are reality TV that the people in the Netflix Christmas movie universe watch as their reality TV shows. The Lindsay Lohan remake of Overboard that she did for them, reference like where she loses her memory, which is better than the remake of Overboard, by the way, significantly so. Because Lindsay Lohan is tremendous. I've always thought tremendously talented, a little underrated. Um, but yeah, I mean, she's essentially done what Adam Sandler's done and created a little Netflix empire of her own.
Well, I know I went to college with the director of I Know Who Killed Me. He said she was wonderful on the days that she showed up.
Well, I know she had a lot of trouble too, right? I mean, that's certainly true. A lot of actors do, particularly child actors. So, um, you know, and she certainly, like, since put in a lot of work uh, over
Yeah.
time, right? But yeah, I mean, you could say that I think about a lot of people, but there are some people in the industry who are workers and others who are you know, they kind of wallow in celebrity. And even though I think she went through like a period of child actorhood and through some bad experiences, I don't think she ever really stopped being a worker. You know, it's like Zac Efron, right? Zac Efron's a worker, but he went through a period of like how much, like, I'm sorry, no one can convince me he didn't either use HGH or roids during one period of his time as he was trying to rebrand himself and maybe was buying in a little too much into himself. But he's a worker, and you know I'll watch anything he's in.
I'd say anything, but yeah, he's pretty good. But we've gone way afield from horror.
Yeah, I know, I know. But you know, it's a. These are geek side chats, so
Yeah,
we go from a
yeah,
starting. The whole point of these is to not be scripted and to talk about stuff. But let's bring it back to horror because
yeah.
horror movies are important. You know the H.P. Lovecraft. See, I actually brought my uh, H.P. Lovecraft Book of Horror, which is actually a collection that Stephen Jones and Dave Carson did of short stories that are referenced by H.P. Lovecraft in his essay Supernatural Horror in Literature, which was originally published in one fanzine, but then was republished in another fanzine called The Fantasy Fan, which I've edited the full run of, which is in public domain, but I'm still waiting to add some illustrations and stuff before I offer my version of the Fantasy Fan on Kindle or whatever. I'll probably do it for print on demand too. But it's one of the most interesting fanzines ever created, and I think it was created by like a 16-year-old boy who got H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and since you're wearing famous monsters, Forrest Ackerman to write in as fans to this fanzine from some random kid, which I think is pretty remarkable. But what Lovecraft says is he says the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Now,
Yes.
yeah, right? And that I think, touches a little bit on the kind of sentiment that the author was having, because the moment we add lore, it becomes a little better known, it becomes a little more comfortable, right? It's a little less unsettling to us as viewers. It becomes, that's why the first Nightmare on Elm Street is more terrifying than the Dream Warriors, right? Which is
That's
more fun.
that's fair, but then New Nightmare sort of takes it back and
Yeah.
makes it weird again. And I don't I wonder with art whether he's scared. Art's kind of fun at this point. Like I feel bad. I heard, and I think this is just made up, that they pulled some of the Art the Clown cosplayers from Halloween Horror Nights because people just wanted to hug him and not be afraid of him because they liked him so much. I don't know if he's. I feel like he's a little scarier as an unkillable satanic force than just as like the worst person in the world who messes up bathrooms and chops people in half. Um, and certainly the climax of three is has some of the most horrible stuff in it. But I was actually laughing at it by the time they're doing the thing where it's like they're putting a rat in a tube and doing the thing where they put a flame behind it so that the rat, obviously it's the urban legend that the rat's going to eat its way out because that's its escape hatch. I don't know how real any of it, but that was just too funny to me. So yeah, I think David Lynch is scary because he takes away everything familiar to you about reality itself, and that's why there's a great fear of the unknown going on in there. And for me, a horror movie that slowly takes away everything that makes you comfortable is usually the most unsettling. But I think you can also do one that's just based on real life fears, and that'll work too if it strikes the same nerve. And it doesn't have to be unknown. Something like Lucky McKee's May. Obviously, he's a friend of mine. A lot of friends of mine worked on that, but it's really about the fear of finding a friend, which in LA at the time, without social media, was incredibly hard and just finding friends and being rejected and having them find out the one weird thing about you that just turns them off. There's nothing that unknown about May as a character. It's that you do know that thing, and the movie's tweaking that nerve.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I watch something like It Follows, and that is a film about sexually transmitted disease, whether people really realize it or not. But
Oh
it's
yeah, Blake.
Yeah, I mean, but for a generation that, when you look at the statistics, right, engages in sexual activity less than earlier generations at that time, and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, well, they're not really being measured yet, but Gen Z is even less than the millennials were. For a generation that's more risk averse with that behavior to begin with, right? Something like It Follows, which to me was a pretty, like, I enjoyed it, but it's a pretty mundane horror film. Like, I'm like, okay, right, I get where this is going. It's interesting. I really like some of the effects. I like that it's unending and relentless. This speaks to me. The score was very effective, and it was well shot in Detroit on $0. And I think the actors did a bang up job too. But you know, it didn't scare me. But I know some young people that genuinely like really connected with them in a fearful way, right? Because it's about the unknown,
I found the scares work. The fact that you don't know where it's coming from and you don't know who it's going to be the first time.
right?
That aspect of it I thought was very well done with the creepiness.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So
I
that
think that works.
so that worked on me. Yeah, but then you find yourself thinking afterwards, well, why don't you just fly overseas? Is it going to cross the Atlantic Ocean? How's it
It'll
going to
take a
do that?
while. It'll take a
Yeah,
while, but you'll get plenty of time, you
yeah,
know, and then you can do it again,
yeah.
right? But yeah, I mean, but it's touching on a real fear and things that are unknown. But like going to your point on the humor and stuff in the Terrifier series, I was thinking about, right, the difference between The Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, right? Is the first one,
Yeah,
there are a couple moments where you'll laugh because it takes the horror to absurd moments, but it wasn't directed for laughs.
right.
And with the exception, whereas Evil Dead 2 is a horror comedy, right? It's meant to make you laugh. It references a
Yes.
lot of traditional comedy things. I don't want to go into great detail, but ranging from the Three Stooges to a lot of other stuff
Yeah.
in there, Harold Lloyd and others. Um, and Bruce Campbell is utterly brilliant in it as that kind of classic comedy character. And they're actually able in Evil Dead 2, with one exception, to push the graphic elements of the horror further because of that comedic element, right? That they're able to push the Overton window of our discomfort with gore and violence because of the comedy. And I say with one exception, and I don't want to talk about what that exception is. I'll just say it happens outside. That scene is not pushed overboard in Evil Dead 2, and it's pushed pretty far in the Evil Dead in a way that is horrific and disturbing, but it's supposed to be horrific and
Yeah.
disturbing. So
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. The one thing that Damien Leone as an effects artist really does in the Terrifier movies that I think has made people, recoil and vomit and faint and think that this is over the top is I think if he didn't innovate this, he's certainly one of the more prominent artists in this field. Is he'll have art, torture or chop up somebody until please beep out that word if you have to that I just said. But you'll have something that you're pretty sure is a dummy because it's so severed, it's so bloody that it can't possibly be real, right? And then he'll digitally superimpose like eyes and a mouth of a real person. It'll open its eyes and it short circuits your suspension of disbelief because you're like, holy crap, that's a person. They are still alive and they must be in the worst pain imaginable. And I know from listening to the commentary that it's that he's digitally added facial features seamlessly to a bloody dummy, and that's that's an innovation of his, and we're eventually going to get used to it. But I think that's one of the things Terrifier does that is making people viscerally react to those movies.
Sure, and I can see that. And once again, right, that touches to the unknown because you have no idea how he does that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you do now because you
yeah,
listened to the
yeah,
commentary, and that'll probably change that and how you perceive
yeah.
it in the future, right? It'll mute
Yeah, and I was
the effect.
disappointed actually. The third one doesn't have a commentary track. He's done a commentary on everything except Terrifier 3. Maybe holding out for a double dip. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it'd be good. I mean, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, I'll eventually get around to watching them. I mean, I do watch a decent amount of horror movies, but as you know, right, my movie tastes are so diverse that it's hard to keep up with all the genre that I enjoy. So, you
It's hard
know,
to keep up, period. I mean, I don't even have kids. I just have a wife, but I've been waiting all year. I've wanted all year to see Sinners, right? It's a
oh
3-hour
sure,
movie. I haven't been able to get those 3 hours, and the one time I did, I ended up falling asleep because I was just so tired, and I was just like, I'm not
sure.
doing the movie justice. I got to start again. So I still have not seen Sinners all the way through, and I loved what I saw.
Yeah, it's
And
very
I
good.
I wish I had more time to just watch movies, but also because movie criticism doesn't pay the bills, I work like 3 other jobs. So
Yeah, I mean,
the
and that's another change in the marketplace, right? I mean, I don't want to get too much out in the weeds again, right? But there was recently a story in the Atlantic Monthly about a job that was offered for a literary journal in New York called N+1 that was offering for a managing editor 60 grand a year. And this is a non-profit literary journal, and they wanted you to live in New York, which I think is a bit on 60 grand a year. I think is a bit much to ask. But my only comment is if that was remote, I think that would be fair given the size of the journal and all of that. But the person working for Atlantic or being hired by Atlantic, was like, how dare they offer this salary? I'm like, well, okay, you work for a magazine owned by a billionaire that pays ridiculously high amounts of money, whereas you have to have starting positions somewhere, and this is a well-respected journal, and we see that with film criticism too, right? I mean, a lot of film critics, talented film critics who are good at writing deep analyses and know film well are being displaced by people who do 30-second to 2.5 minute quick bits on TikTok that's who the industry targets for the screenings or for press releases and things like that because and maybe even I don't know I'm not gonna go full what is it payola on it, but certainly those are the people that they're reaching out to, and because the only thing that the studios care about is getting people familiar with their properties to get their butts in the seats or their eyes on the screen, and uh, they don't need someone to do a deep analysis of that, which I think that underserves the community or underserves the audience, but because I think good criticism, and my feelings on this. I really think that critics should primarily spend most of their time advocating for the overlooked. You don't have to review a Star Wars movie. I mean, you do for the algorithm, but
yeah,
you don't have to review a Star Wars movie to inform audiences because uh, at one time they just would go to see them, but now they already know their position in the culture war, so they're either going to see it or not based on it being, Star Wars, and what they
and
think of the state of the franchise today.
the beauty of Substack is I can just review what I want now. If I see something that seems interesting, they'll send me a link. Sure, let me check it out. At the same time, Superman is by far my biggest traffic review. That's not a paywalled classic. The paywalled classic reviews, according to Substack's algorithm, do the best, which I can't figure out because I only have 13 paying subscribers. So maybe a lot of people are just clicking on the first paragraph. I don't know. But when you do talk to kids today, I don't know about your kids, but the ones I talk to, they do prefer video. They don't want to read. They would rather watch someone talking to them about the movie. And you do have to go where that market is a little bit, and that's why I've tried to move on to TikTok a little bit. It's hard for me to generate the discipline for that. I do some silly stuff on TikTok, but the so-called, nerd sites, so many of which I've worked for, and I don't even care to single any of them out, but they're not serving the kids either. They're not, they're still stuck in the let's cover Marvel and DC and not Chainsaw Man or Dan or, even K-pop Demon Hunters took them completely by surprise. And if there are a couple of teenagers out here I talk to, and it doesn't surprise me that those movies are doing well because that's what these kids are into. So you have to serve that market, and maybe when they're older, they'll want to read more detailed analysis. I don't know. Maybe we just have to have conversations like this about their movies, and they'll have the attention
Yeah.
span to watch them. I hope. We'll see.
I mean, I think outside of the people who are actual cultural experts on Korean literature and culture, I'm just going to say this. I think my analysis of K-pop Demon Hunters and discussing it in the context of other Korean films like Among the Gods is the best mainstream critique of the film out there. And I mean, it's done pretty well for my site, the post on that. And of course, I use that as an opportunity to talk about some other excellent stuff that has cinema that's come out of Korea over the past 20 years. And certainly Korea's been making great movies for more than 20 years. I'm just highlighting in the past 20 years on there because those are films that are kind of referenced in K-pop Demon Hunters, or my interest people who saw that. But yeah, I mean, when I talk with kids today, this is the interesting thing, like, and I'm glad that we're bringing it to the kids today. This is one of those cases where I'm going to say the kids are all right, but that they were underserved by their teachers. So one of the things that I noticed, and as you know, I used to work at a civic engagement nonprofit, and that meant that when Common Core was being debated and deliberated, excuse me, I was privy to a lot of those discussions. Which, this is not conspiracy oriented. It's not like it's not national curriculum or anything like that. It was literally different states negotiating to have a similar curriculum because of the way the textbook industry is organized for schools. Essentially, two states dictate what the textbooks for the country are, and those are Texas and California, right? They're large populations of public school, and one is, this is what the liberal textbooks are going to be like, this is what the conservative textbooks are going to be like, and that's it. Right? And then you just know, you're just going to buy what you're going to buy. But one of the things that Common Core did on the math side, I thought they did very well. I think it needed a couple tweaks, but essentially they started kids with number theory and then worked their way up from there, so that they would have that even kids who weren't like intuitive with mathematics would learn the basics in how to think like a kid who's intuitive in mathematics. So they were given some grounding in the ways of thinking about how numbers interact or constructs interact. And it's very much like they were teaching it the way that Khan Academy teaches math, which I thought was really cool. But with civics and English literature, they decided they wanted to focus on a lot of primary source documents. But when I say a lot, I mean a lot. So that meant that the readings that they were giving young people were no longer the longer readings. They were shorter readings, right? So they would take excerpts from stuff and give it to them. And the novels that they read today, sure, some of them are the same novels we read as kids. Fahrenheit 451, Catcher in the Rye, The Great Gatsby, Of Mice and Men, Pride and Prejudice. But they're all the same list, but they're missing things too. Like there's no Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? There's no, like, the longer Moby Dick. You would never have a kid have the opportunity to read Moby Dick or Harlan Ellison's The Invisible Man as their choice from the list, although they are, by the way, in the core curriculum, Common Core. They're in there as potential recommendations, but those would be things that they would take excerpts from rather than give you the book. And I think, you know, I think that they sold the kids short. They said, oh, they can't read long, so they taught them to not read long. Um, and that's their experience. So they have to find a way to push themselves to, I mean, for goodness sake, they're told, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, they're told that the Federalist Papers are difficult to read because, they're written at this elevated level. The Federalist Papers were op-eds written for farmers in 1787. You know, they're not, I mean, they do have high concepts in them. I'm not saying they're not deep, but they're also not hard to read. Um, that we've told a whole generation of kids, and maybe even older than one generation, that things that aren't hard to read are hard to read, and they just have believed us. So then they go to video where, there's a lot of good video out there that does a good job of explaining stuff in great detail. If you've got Veritasium and, Mark Rober and Smarter Every Day and Khan Academy, right? I mean, you've got, let alone like the just pithy stuff. But if you've got essentially long form journalism available to you in that, you're gonna shy away. But that's led to the death of long form journalism, and you know, I I'm saddened by that. I want there to be critics along the lines of Andrew Saris and Pauline Kael, and like I don't know that there's ever been a Pauline Kael review I've agreed with, but I recognize her craft as a writer. She challenges me, and and they're not short reviews, right? They're
Oh,
like when she writes a review, she was getting paid big money to write 10 pages or whatever for a review.
well, and love it or hate it, or make whatever you can of it, they weren't burdened by the whole spoiler notion back then. You could write about the entire movie because a lot of times people would, well, some people would read it afterwards. My parents would never go see a movie until the reviews came out first and they could see them, which was weird
Right,
when you have movies like The Ice Pirates come into theaters in Ireland for one day only, and they'd wait for the review, but there would be no review. It would be gone because that was cheap filler.
right.
I was heartened that IO9 did. They ran a piece by Germain Lussier that was a set visit to something recently. I forget what it was, but they ran the entire set visit as one long piece, like it was an alt weekly cover story. And I love that because the last set visit piece I did was like that. It was Transformers 4, which I ended up loving and being the only one who did. No, Transformers 5. Sorry, the last night. And I'm sure people think I love it just because I was on the set. I don't believe that. Fervently in my heart, I don't believe that that's the reason. Uh, but yeah, I wrote that as a long form piece for Nerdist, and it was one of my last pieces for them. And ever after that, every set visit that anyone else did had to be broken down into top 10 lists. It was like 10 things we learned from the producer on this set, 10 things we saw on this, and they had to pitch the article as multiple top 10 lists and get approval from editors on this instead of just writing one long form piece about what it's like to be on that set. And for me, watching Michael Bay direct action in real time, which is what I want to read about.
Well, I mean, that's like the defense of I Frankenstein, right? That you hired me to write
Yeah.
uh, for for the robot
Yeah,
site.
the
That had to be a,
listicle model we had, I couldn't get away from that, but I tried to tell people you can make anything a listicle, just put numbers on the paragraphs.
right. Yeah, no, right. I mean, essentially I just turned the headers into the numbers, right?
Yeah, yeah,
For the sections. But yeah, I mean, but that was once again that was the craft of the time, and you had websites at that time. You don't see them as much anymore, right? Where all they were trying to do was to get you to click through to a different image, right? That
yes,
would have like a line, and then you would get the ad impressions on that page, and that's
yeah,
all it was about. Was about ad impressions, and that It's part and parcel because in reality, uh, Google undershares the revenue on ads, right? On the CPM, the traditional kind of Mad Men era to today in print or television, the cut on the cost per thousand of any ad is far more equitable than you get through Google ads. Like if you buy a television ad, the cut that the network gets versus that the syndicate gets versus the network is much more equitable than what a YouTuber gets as a cut from what Google charges per thousand views on that site or per thousand impressions, and that's something I think that's going to have to work itself out. And I think when it does, we'll be better for it. We'll get more. Uh, I think we'll get more long form online journalism when that works out. But a couple of windows of opportunity have been missed. When Dan
Yeah.
TDM was at his biggest, he and Ninja and a couple of others could have formed their own company. And they could have gone Universal Artists or United Artists and formed their own studio with servers and stuff that could have been a competitor that offered better CPM to people for the same number of impressions.
I did not do the SEO as well as I could have on Topless Robot / The Robot's Voice, and also I couldn't get them to make the site more SEO friendly format wise until the very last month I was there. But considering how every part of that company has been sold now anyway, I don't think I could have kept it going much longer, even if I had been the best at it. So I don't resent that really anymore.
No, and media is changing a lot. I mean, you talked earlier about the decline of news and the replacement of news with social media, and the place that I see that maybe most acutely is with local news, right? My
Yeah.
wife and I subscribed to the Idaho Press and the Idaho Statesman for a period of time, but we eventually ended our subscription, not for any ideological reasons or anything like that, but just because the vast majority of the content was AP articles, which we could read online, and
Yeah.
there was very little local coverage. And what we wanted from a local paper was local coverage. And there are
Yeah.
some online sites that provide that, Boise Dev and the Capital Sun, but and what is it? There's one that's for Idaho Education that's also and that's a nonprofit, right? I think all three of them are nonprofit news organizations, right? And they're good and they pay a decent wage to their employees, but you know um, they're they're not able to do sometimes as much of the in-depth local reporting that the LA Times at its best can do or the New York Times at its best can do.
Yeah, I think nonprofits may be the future. I also sort of hope that, maybe a bunch of Substackers can be put together and people will see, people will buy them up and put them in magazines like they did with the first iteration of the blogosphere. All the first generation of LA bloggers that we were in, a lot of us got kind of picked up, and some of us, like Matt Welch, are still doing that thing, and some of us have bounced from place to place. And now we're all ending up on Substack. Amy Alcon's on Substack, Andrew Gumbel, Mark Cooper. You know,
Matt
we could
Welch is
all be
on.
snapped up and put in a bundle, and that would be great. But I've sort of wondered, because I saw Drew McWeeny made a big deal about how he's going to put everything paywalled on his, and I'm like, I don't think I can do that. You do that as a film critic, and you're not going to be in the conversation anymore. And he doesn't care
Yeah.
about that, so that's great for him. But I need my reviews to still be in the conversation. I think they're only valuable as a way to, they're only valuable to publicists certainly that way. So I'm still finding the balance.
Well, certainly, I'm gonna try when I hit a point of big enough non-subscriber database, base. I'm thinking 5,000 is what I want to hit for this, and I'm not there yet. I'm at 1,200 subscribers,
Those of you
but
watching, pump up the numbers. Recommend it to your friends. Come on, mash that button.
certainly it's easy to make an LLC here in Idaho. It's not particularly onerous, and to put, to change Geekarati to an LLC and then turn it into a magazine format where I host other Substack columns, right, as a
Yeah.
magazine, to turn it to a magazine. That's my goal. And then, you know,
And a noble
I
one.
don't know that I'd ever paywall anything, but my hope would be to get enough paid subscribers to go forward. And maybe, I don't know, maybe some interviews, or like if you're able to get some like exclusive interview, paywall that. But, most of the normal reviews and stuff to keep out of paywall, because I think, and maybe we'd get, some actual advertisement stuff that people would pay us to do like a bit in the middle. I wouldn't hesitate to do that, so long as it wasn't related directly to what we're reviewing at the time. You showed the Ben Cooper action figure of Art the Clown there.
Yeah.
I wouldn't hesitate to do a commercial promoting NECA action figures or anything. I just then wouldn't review them, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Or you
but
got you got somebody else too, and you put a hard and
no, that's what I
fast
meant. I
wall.
wouldn't review them. Other people could, certainly you could review
Yeah.
them. But I,
I'm going to, by the way, review those the two arts I showed you. I am going to review those. I've already started taking
right?
photos, so
Yeah, but I mean,
that's a little future.
no, but I think that's one of the frustrations about Substack is there's a lot of stuff worth being a paid subscriber to, but you can't actually afford to be a paid
Right.
subscriber to everything, because it's essentially, subscribing to a magazine for each one, because the minimum I think is $5 a month that Substack will let you charge. And that's a cheap magazine, but it's a magazine a month. And for a single person, that's pretty hard.
Yeah.
I will add that with the new feature that they list whether or not the people are subscribers to others and whether or not they read other sites, I am using that as kind of a guideline as to whether or not I will follow somebody else. Not subscribers. I understand we can't paid subscribe. That's ridiculous and too demanding. But if somebody doesn't even bother to read any other Substacks, then they're just not worth my time. I don't care if they've got 1 million subscribers, and the person I'm thinking of has, I don't know if it's 1 million, but a lot of subscribers, and they don't even bother to read any other Substack. And I was just like, no, you're not a part of the Substackosphere, and you shouldn't even pretend to be. And maybe that's, having been a part of that Los Angeles blogosphere for a period of time where, people, some of them were very political, right? You and I weren't
Oh,
political
yeah.
bloggers, but some of them were very political on opposite sides of the political aisle, and yet they were still out there promoting each other, right?
Yeah.
As a kind of hardworking uh, beat, community, and I like that, and I like that about
Yeah.
Substack too. I like it when Substack mirrors the best of the blogosphere, which it often does,
Yeah.
and I roll my eyes at it when it embodies the worst of Twitter and Blue Sky,
Yeah.
which isn't that common, but it does happen. But yeah, so since we're winding down, and I want to wind down so you
You
can
are
spend.
freezing on me.
Oh, yeah, well, I've got good connection, so,
Okay.
uh,
Well, I'm in the middle of the desert, so
yeah, no,
maybe on my end. Now you're moving again. It was real, just very quick.
right, so I was just gonna say, like, since we're winding down, uh, what are 5 horror movies that you would recommend that maybe have been overlooked?
Well, I'm going to say Terrifier 2, I think is a modern masterpiece. I my one of my friends who, is my age, loves Nightmare on Elm Street and says, Terrifier is not my thing. It's not my thing. I'm not familiar with it. It's the kids say, I'm like, if you like Freddy Krueger, watch Terrifier 2 because you will get something out of it. There is some connective tissue there. I'm trying to think because I haven't seen a lot of the big ones this year, and a lot of them have been disappointing. I just saw one called The Vile that is a feminist Muslim horror movie from the Arab Emirates, which is quite something. It's about polygamy. You know, the husband brings home a newer, younger second wife, and she is maybe not what she seems, or maybe the old wife is just being super paranoid about being replaced. That is one of the better horror movies I've seen this year. I'm trying to think. The remake of The Blob certainly used to be very underrated. I don't think it is anymore. I talk to more and more people for whom that's kind of a formative movie. Uh,
Sure.
the the first three Saw movies I think are great. When it started getting super convoluted with the lore, it's kind of like the more recent Fast and Furious movies where I'm losing interest. Although Saw 10 was really good, brought it all back around, and the the extras on the disc, like there's one that shows the main master shot of Tobin Bell just acting with everybody, and it's a phenomenal job, and you got to watch that extra of just the uninterrupted single take version of that. What else? I remember last year on Geekarati I recommended Threads. That's a whole different kind of horror that's completely existential, and
Yeah.
unlike its American counterpart, The Day After, it hasn't dated at all. Because one thing I also said this in the Repo Man review: if you make a movie about the lower classes, you're going to see it not date as much over time, because a lot of what it's like, a lot of lower class stuff is going to stay the same over time in a way that a quote unquote modern house is not going to, or anyone who's being trendy or glamorous with the times. So Threads is very existential horror and will ruin your day if that's what you want. It'll do it very well. Uh, what are some other underserved ones? I should have prepared better for that question, but um, the Phantasm movies are, I think underrated. There's a tremendous, because the way they're promoted, you think it's just about a tall guy throwing balls at people with spikes in them, and the insane level of world building mythology that goes on in those movies, even to the much cheaper sequels. Don Coscarelli's brilliant at that. Also, John dies at the end is kind of a masterpiece of that, because he's building on someone else's insane world building and adding to it himself, because it's based on a novel. Bubba Hotep, similarly. A lot of Coscarelli stuff. I'm ashamed to say that The Beastmaster remains one of my blind spots. I've never seen it. So that's one I got to pick up on.
Oh, you definitely have to watch The Beastmaster.
Yeah, I know, horrifying, right?
Oh,
I think,
I'm shocked that you've never seen that. I
well,
mean,
you know what I
they're
think
already they're already remaking Deathstalker, for God's sake. You gotta at least watch that sword and sword, the pinnacle of sword and sorcery classics outside of
you
Conan.
know what I think it is I read, my dad gave me the novel at a young age, thinking that it was like all these movie adaptation novels, and the novel is completely unrelated virtually to the movie. And
Yeah.
so when I read the synopsis of the movie, I was like, I was one of these purists. I was like, why are they ruining the book? So I used to be a real purist about that. There's an interview with me in an Irish newspaper, because I had a poem published in a book at the age of 10, and so I made the news headlines. And there's an interview with me where I'm like, I want to be a movie maker. I want to make the H.G. Wells books right and not change anything from the books the way all these other adaptations have. you know. So I was like that even then. I was, I had very sort of rigid
Yeah.
thinking
So, yeah, that's all right. I mean,
about the
a
things I like.
10-year-old, you're supposed to have
Yeah.
strong opinions when you're 10. Now, the only thing that I'll add, and I'll finish off with this, is, uh, the thing about the Phantasm movies. If you're a fan of Stranger Things and like the whole concept of the Upside Down and the battles against some unseen forces, I'm sorry, man. That's Phantasm. Like
Yeah.
it's completely it's mind blowing what they did with that film. And you know there's some real creative stuff going on with the editing, certainly with the narrative, and the timeline of the narrative, and you know what it means to be a hero and things like that in the Phantasm movies. That's kind of mind blowing, and like the fears that young people have that are touched on, I think, extraordinarily well in those movies. And I do think that Stranger Things touches on a lot of the same elements even I don't know if the Duffer Brothers are doing it on purpose, but I can't believe they haven't watched Phantasm. I mean, I just
Oh,
can't.
there's no way. There's no way they haven't seen at least the first one. They may not have watched all, what is it, 5 or 6 that they got up to. I don't think even I've watched the last one, but I've watched at least 4 of them, and they were all not as huge a fan of the second because I think recasting the lead with James LeGros was not a great decision, and they remedied it in the follow-up sequels. But still worth it. Still an amazing series that just doesn't compromise and goes to strange narrative places and isn't really easy to sum up. Where
Yeah,
I
so
love it strange is not so much the references, but the nostalgia. That third season where they're at the mall, I was just like, oh my God, I miss the summers at the mall so much. That really tapped a nerve for me more than any of the references to anything else. It was the recollections of hanging out at a mall in the summer.
Yeah, they actually did a better job of capturing what it was like to hang out in the malls than Mallrats did, which that's high praise indeed.
It depends on
Well,
the type of mall, perhaps, I think, because
maybe,
you
maybe, but we turned our 30-minute talk into an hour and 30 minutes. So I
oh
think I
man,
think I think we'll leave off with that. It's been great chatting with you. We'll chat again. We'll talk about some other movies soon. I'd like to maybe once a month do a chat with you, and then I've got some
absolutely.
other people to try to line
Yeah.
up as well. It's certainly easier to just chat than to write an article. As you know, I do a lot
Yeah.
of research when I write something, and
Yeah.
I embed a lot of hyperlinks from time to time when I'm making
Yes.
truth claims about something. I'm kind of like David Foster Wallace is with footnotes with hyperlinks. But
I love not having to do that. And not I love on Substack that I can just say my opinion. I'm like, if you don't believe me, fine. I'm not gonna back I'm not gonna worry about backing it up. You can believe me or not. It doesn't matter. It's just me.
that's right. So it's been great chatting with you, and I'll chat with you again next time. This has been Geek Karate chat number 3. What's up with the kids today? The kids are all right.
Started out with a blog and a mic, talking RPGs and Friday night fights. Double tap to play, roll for your fate. Geek Karate's back and the takes are great.